Marie Klein. And I'll be your host for tonight. So briefly, the Sioux Climate Hub is a citizen-led volunteer organization focusing on advancing climate change mitigation and adaptation in the Algoma region through education and engagement. We're also a chapter of the global organization, Climate Reality, which consists of a diverse group of individuals across the world committed to building a sustainable future together. Our webinar series is aimed at providing citizens with various opportunities for undertaking local climate change action and mitigation. We also want to highlight the many individuals, groups, and organizations that are currently engaged in climate change action across the region. Our webinars are held as 1-hour events on a monthly basis. They're usually from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. the last Friday of each month, and they're entirely free and online, so please join up. For tonight's presentation, I'd like to start by asking Juliana Lesage-Corbière from Batchewana First Nation to begin tonight's webinar with an Indigenous land acknowledgement before I introduce Dr. Paul Hazlett.
Anim Bojo, Geto Gabo and Dishnakas, Batchewana First Nation, Donjapa, Maingun and Do Daminishnave Quayandao. Anin everyone, my English name is Juliana Lesage-Corbière, but the name given to me through ceremony is the one who stands in the center. I am a member of Batchewana First Nation and also stand with the Wolf Clan and as a Anishinaabe woman. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territory of Bouting, the place of the rapids, but also known as the gathering place for so many years, and a signatory of the Robinson-Huron Treaty. When we do land acknowledgements, I often think that we leave out acknowledging those that continue to sustain us to this day, which is all of our relations, and recognizing not only each species, but waterway and those that give us life, our Mother Earth. So I'm really excited to join you, and especially on my home lands here, so miigwech.
Thank you, Juliana. Carmen, could you get to the next slide, please? Okay, so yeah, tonight's speaker is going to be Dr. Paul Hazlett. Paul will be talking about climate change, composting, and the links between the two. Just as a protocol here, just so you know, for continuity and to avoid interruptions tonight, we will have everyone's speakers muted during the presentation. So please put your questions in the chat, and Paul will try to answer them all after the formal presentation. And as a bonus feature, next month's Climate Hub webinar will be Kim Chapman talking about cycling or carbon-free transportation. So she'll be providing information about bikes, local routes, and safe cycling practices. And that'll be Wednesday, June the 23rd at 7:30. So look for the Everbright announcement and please join us for that as well. Well, back to Paul. Paul is an internationally recognized soil scientist and educator, recently retired from the Canadian Forest Service here in Sault Ste. Marie. His research has focused on the impacts of climate change and forest management practices on long-term soil sustainability. This has included groundbreaking research at the Turkey Lakes watershed just north of Sault Ste. Marie and in Ontario's boreal forest as part of the North American Long-Term Soil Productivity Network. Recently, he founded AshNet, which is a national research network looking at applying domestic and industrial wood ash to forests to reduce landfill waste and improve soil fertility. At the local level, Paul has been heavily involved with education, youth, and Indigenous communities, including with the Ontario Youth Envirothon and as a forest soils professor at Sault College. And while his friendly, soft-spoken nature belies Paul's status as one of Canada's leading soil scientists, he really is a down-to-earth guy with a great sense of humor. Paul.
Well, thanks a lot, Rob. I appreciate that introduction. I'll try and put up my presentation here, and how about I get a thumbs up from you, Rob, if you can see it.
Okay, looks good.
It's there, okay. Well, great, well, again, thanks, Rob, for the introduction. I really thank the Sioux Climate Hub for inviting me to give this talk this evening. I started off with a title about looking at organisms in the soil, the life inside the soil, and then realized shortly after sending the title to Rob and Carmen that this group would really be interested in those links between composting and climate change. So I've retitled it to Composting and Climate Change, Can It Help? Thinking a bit more about the goal of the Sioux Climate Hub and the people that are involved in it in this region. I think what I'm going to try and do throughout the presentation, I have a feeling that some of this group will be very experienced in composting and probably know a lot about it. But I'm going to go over some basics about composting anyways, but I hope to add some new information through the presentation that could be beneficial to those folks that are really experienced as well. So knowing quite a diverse audience here, I thought I'd try and capture a little bit of both for everybody. So I hope by the end of it, everybody's learned a little bit of something, or at least reinforced what they already knew. See, I told you, Ted, now it's not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just a quick outline. We're on the second slide. You can see that, I hope. I'm going to cover a little bit about just a primer on the living soil and the function of organisms within the soil, then take a look at some of the different organisms that exist in the soil. And soil organisms in action, I'll talk about composting, and then I'll close it off with some of the links between composting and climate change. A bit about me, a bit more than what Rob told initially, just to give you a bit of perspective of where I come from and how I got interested in soils in the first place. On the right hand of this slide is a picture of Stirling Hall. That's at Queen's University. I grew up in Kingston, Ontario. This Stirling Hall is much like the old-fashioned amphitheater type lecture hall. And I'm not actually in this photo, but if I was, I'd be right up at the back row there against the wall at the back of this class. And I was lucky enough in second year university, like a lot of students my age then and now, have no clue what I'm doing there or no clue what I want to do. And luckily enough for me, this gentleman on the right, GK Ken Rutherford, walked into the class, and he was the professor for the Introduction to Soil Science class at Queen's University. I think Rob had him as well for a professor when he was there. Anyways, Dr. Rutherford, with this shock of white hair, would come into the class with a white lab coat, very much looking like the Mr. Clean type guy walking at the bottom of the lecture hall. And he came into the first class with a soil sample in his hand, walked up the center aisle of this amphitheater and threw a soil sample to me. And this was a sample of a Leda clay, L-E-D-A. That's a clay that exists in the Ottawa Valley area that's really well known for liquefying when it gets wet. It's a marine clay. And the big problem with this clay, of course, is if you build a house on it and it liquefies, your house goes tumbling down into the ravine. But the key thing for me was, you could say after that point, I was really hooked on soils. Kent Rutherford, excuse me, was quite an engaging professor and more than that way, and really got me interested at that early stage of university and wanting to be in soils and work in the field of soils. At the same time, coincidentally, and this is a true story, believe it or not, I was working in the summertime at the Cataraqui Cemetery in Kingston. And if any of you know that area, you'll know that the Cataraqui Cemetery is a huge cemetery over a very diverse landscape, flat plains and hills and valleys. And I spent several summers in university actually digging graves at the Cataraqui Cemetery. The real claim to fame for Cataraqui Cemetery is it's the burial place of Sir John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister. But I had these two things going on at the same time that, again, as strange as it seems, it really helped me to coalesce my thinking around the fact that this is something I wanted to work in as I moved on for a career. So after I finished my undergraduate in physical geography, I I decided to do a master's degree, and Ken Rutherford was graceful enough to take me on as a master's student. And that's me up at the upper left looking for soil in the area at Coniston, east of Sudbury. So I did my master's degree in Sudbury looking at metal pollution in soils there, and really learning a lot from Ken Rutherford and a lot about human effects on the environment and the soil that we count on. I was lucky enough after this time period during my master's to get hired by the gentleman on the lower left of this picture. That's Neil Foster, passed away quite a few years ago now, way too young from cancer. Neil hired me and mentored me and encouraged me to go back to school partway through my working career with the Canadian Forest Service. And so I went back to the University of Guelph and did my PhD, sort of mid to late career, I guess you could say. So my career's been spent, as Rob said, I just retired after 38 years at the Great Lakes Forestry Centre on Queen Street. And the picture at the top right is Batchewana Mountain. Many of you may know that spot. It's sort of the anchor, one of the highest points in Ontario within the Turkey Lake watershed. So just a bit about myself in a quick way to let you know where I'm coming from and some of my background and experience in soils. So we'll talk a little bit in general to start off here about soil organisms. And I think one thing I'd like to just point out is even though we don't think of this very much, it's one of the most diverse and complex habitats on Earth within the soil. And the reason we don't think about it so much is because of the fact that most of the soil organisms aren't visible to us without a microscope to look at these organisms. And nowhere in nature are species so densely packed as in soil communities. So here's just an image of some soil, if you like. I don't know if you can see my mouse there, probably, and hopefully you can. But generally, we think of, when we think of soil, just as a general person in the public thinking about soil, we think about the solid material that is part of soil. So we're talking about the grains of sands and silts and clays, different sizes of mineral particles that exist within the soil. But you might be surprised to know that in an average soil, those mineral grains make up less than 50% of the soil volume. So we think of the mineral materials about 45% of an average soil volume. Another 5% of the average soil volume is organic material. So that would be decomposing plant parts, organic matter that's present in the soil. And again, that can range below 5% in some soils up to 20% in very organic peat type soils. But again, it's a very small proportion of the soil. The other 50% of the soil, and this is where all the soil organisms hang out, is what we call this pore space. So that's the air and the water that's within a soil. And that takes up about 50% of that pore space. And you can think of that pore space as being more filled with water after a heavy rain, and the pores are filled with rain, or more airspace after a drought period and the soil has dried out. The best way I like to think about this and help to remember it was given to me once by a student that I was working with in Envirothon. And after I described these components of the soil to the student put out their hands like this and said, "Oh my goodness, I'm walking on air and water here. 50% of what I'm on is air and water." So that's a way to think of that. But these organisms that we're going to focus on in the presentation here are, like I said, in this pore space throughout the soil. And it's really this living organisms within the soil that make soil soil. So soil is life. A handful of soil, we say, of fertile soil has more living organisms than there are people on the planet Earth. I was checking the population counter on Earth going up several people every second. We're up to about 7.9 billion people on the earth right now. And that's about how many organisms we find in a single handful of fertile soil. And that's really the thing that distinguishes soil from dirt, if you like. I'm not one of those really sensitive soil scientist guys that gets all angry when somebody calls it dirt, but I do like to have a running commentary with my grandchildren about it that tell me when I say I love soil, they say you love dirt, Papa, and I'll argue with them. So the difference is dirt, the stuff that's under your fingernails or on the knees of your pants or out of place, is really not alive like soil is with all these organisms. And these are the organisms that we really need in the soil. They provide the link between the soil chemical and physical properties and the things that we needed soil to do. So to provide a growing medium for plants, to provide us with clean water, to provide us with biodiversity and habitat for organisms, not only the small ones, but the big ones too. So just to go through a list of some of these important functions, before we look at the actual organisms in a bit more detail, what do these organisms do? Why are they important to soil? So the first one I've got there is the maintenance of soil structure. And what I'm talking about in soil structure is how soil particles are held together in aggregates or beds. So you could think of something like a sandy soil on a beach really has no structure. Those sand particles you can pour out of your hand, they're loose, they are not held together. But in a lot of forestry soils and agricultural soils, the clay and the silt-sized particles within a soil will be bound together. And one of the ways that they're bound together is from exudates from different microorganisms that exist within the soil. On top of that, there are certain organisms that also burrow within the soil that create this structure. And structure is important in terms of the next item here, which is the regulation of soil hydrologic processes. So how water moves through soil, how water is stored in soil. Also, because of those controlling factors of the organisms on structure is another important function. The organisms also play a role in the exchange of gases. So from the atmosphere into the soil, into that pore space, and a role therefore in carbon sequestration within soils as well. Soils are also responsible, or sorry, soil organisms are also responsible for the detoxification of soil. And some of you, I'm sure, have heard of using soil to clean up different spill sites and so on. The role of different organisms in converting hazardous chemicals, either natural or man-made chemicals in soil, is very important. And like I said, used for remediation of sites as well. Probably the main thing that we think of organisms in soil, the ones we think about the most are the next couple of ones, and that's around the decomposition of organic matter. So breaking down plants and animal parts into the nutrients that the regrowth on sites need, either agricultural crops, forests, or plants of any kind. And this also is involved in the next one, which is the nutrient cycling. So this is the consuming, the digesting, and the cycling of nutrients and the cycling of organisms within the soil food web. Again, breaking down that organic matter, putting it into forms that plants can access over time. Soil organisms also play a role in the suppression of pests and parasites and diseases. And I think I'm going to show in a few seconds a slide of a soil food web. But when you think about it, it's really a killing field in the soil. Different organisms are eating other organisms. And in this way, they can be used as pest control methods. Some of the ones that we might think about commonly are people that use soil nematodes, which is a microscopic worm to control grubs in the lawn. There are other fungi that are used to control certain pests that are natural pathogens to soil pests that we might have that are pests for agriculture, for example. So that's another important function of these soil organisms. Sources of food and medicines. So obviously, many of the antibiotics that we have in the world right now, including penicillin and tetracycline and many other ones, are actually from soil organisms, the antibiotics that they create. So they've originated there. And some of the most breaking scientific discoveries in the last number of years around medicines have come from large research teams that have basically been scanning soil organisms to see if there are potential antibiotics that can come from the soil. This in light of the fact that we have many more bacteria that are resistant to the traditional antibiotics that we use in medicine now. So that's something that's been going on since the turn of the century, or sorry, the turn of the 1900s, and is continuing today. Some soil organisms also have symbiotic relationships with plants and their roots. I'm going to look at that in detail in a moment there. And there's other soil organisms that help to control plant growth. If you think of certain rhizobium bacteria that are responsible for fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere and making it available to plants. So if you ever thought before tonight that the organisms are doing one or two things in the soil, I hope this shows you that there's many things that they're doing. So here's just a diagram of that soil food web that I was talking about to give you an idea of the organisms that we're looking at, right from the microscopic up to the higher trophic levels, these feathered and furry animals that we see more often on the landscape and in forests and in any soil environment. At the lower end, we've got plants and organic matter that's turned over. At this trophic level, fungi and bacteria that are processing this organic matter, and then their food that are available for the next level within the food web. So we've got different arthropods, small and large ones, and like I say, right to the top of the food web. So this is an important, this whole idea is of the soil and soil as a habitat and soil organisms as a food source for other organisms within ecosystems is really key here. So let's talk just for a minute about sort of a classification or look at certain types of organisms within the soil. We classify them simply by size into macro, meso, and microbiota, and you can see the different sizes there. Again, some that are just visible with the naked eye, but others that are not. And who are these critters within the soil? So the microbiota are the ones we can see with the naked eye: ants, termites, millipedes, centipedes, earthworms, beetles, and pill bugs. The mesobiota are smaller, springtails and mites. These are ones that can't really burrow within the soil. They live in those soil pores and that pore space that I talked about. Not sure how many of you are familiar with the springtails at all. The best example I can use of those are the snow fleas that you see. They're a type of springtail that you see in the springtime in the snow. Oftentimes when you're snowshoeing and you come back on your route, you'll see them in your tracks. And then when we get down to the microbiota, and this is where we get these huge numbers of organisms that are existing in the soil, we've got the microflora, algae, bacteria, and fungi primarily, and they're those decomposers at the lower end of the food web that I talked about, and also microfauna, and those are the nematodes, the microscopic worms, protozoa, rotifers, and they live usually in soil water films within the pore space of the soil. So just a couple of examples. Here's one very recognizable one, and that's earthworms. Everybody has seen earthworms. We all spend time introducing our kids and grandkids to earthworms. And these organisms, the very visible ones, play a big role through their burrowing in terms of water movement in the soil and soil structure that I talked about. And they also enhance soil fertility and productivity. And I think a lot of you would know that already. Just a quick trivia tidbit here. In 1 acre of agricultural land, that can be more than 1 million earthworms, and they can ingest up to 450 tons of soil per acre per year. So a huge impact within a soil system because of earthworms. The second one to talk about is a hidden organism within the soil, and these are mycorrhizae fungi. So in this case, this fungi is actually an organism that lives in a symbiotic relationship with plants. So what you're seeing in the photograph here is a plant root, and these fine mycelium are the mycorrhizae fungi that are attached to those plant roots. And so they live in a symbiotic relationship. And what that means is that the fungi gets its energy, if you like, it gets its carbon from the plant, from the photosynthesizing plant above ground. And in turn for that, it provides nutrients to the plants that it's associated with. And many plants, trees, smaller plants, understory shrubs have these type of relationships with this type of fungi. And because of the extension of these fungi mycelium into the soil, they can access nutrients and water from places where the plant root cannot reach. This is one, again, that's a hidden one that we don't usually think about. And there's a few really cool tidbits of information about these plants. I like this one in particular. This is a story from several decades ago now about the world's biggest and the oldest organism, and the fact that this organism is actually a giant fungus with this large extent of mycelium that's extending over a huge area, in this case 30 acres, and not too far from here in Crystal Falls, Michigan, just south of the Keweenaw Peninsula over in the UP along the Wisconsin border. So this is a real claim to fame for the researchers that discovered this organism, the biggest and the oldest organism in the world. Now, funny enough, this has been a really interesting story. I didn't pull any of the more recent stories off, but this fungus has recently, over the time period since 1992, has been upped several times by other giant fungi that live in other forests elsewhere in North America. Somewhere around 2000 or something, a larger one was discovered in the state of Washington. And I think the largest one right now being claimed is over, maybe it's 2,500 acres in size, an organism that's found in eastern Oregon. So right now, Oregon has the claim on the world's biggest, oldest organism, sort of following on this story. The researchers that have done this work have used DNA sequencing to identify that this organism from its mycelium that are extending across this huge area, the DNA shows them that it is the same organism. An even more interesting tidbit about this whole mycorrhizae fungi and this mycelium is the work done by Susan Simard from UBC. She coined the Wood Wide Web, a lot of W's there. And I just recently watched a YouTube from her where she was promoting her new book called Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. And I'd encourage all of you to look it up. It's really interesting. She's one of the researchers that first discovered these relationships between trees because of their linkage through the mycelium of their fungi. And she's worked with the idea that there are mother trees out there that are transporting more than just nutrients and water between trees, but also impulses of life, if you like. And this, believe it or not, I found out when I watched this video that her work actually influenced James Cameron. Some of you remember the movie Avatar, which came out in about 2008, 2009, I think it was, where this spirit tree was part of James Cameron's creation for the land of Pandora, where the Na'vi native people inhabited that area, and showed this mycelium network within the movie Avatar. So, but there's some really good stuff. And Susan Simard's got some TED Talks out there too that are really interesting on this topic. So let's move a little bit into composting here. This is our compost in our backyard here in Echo Bay, taken in the wintertime, obviously. I'm going to talk a little about the composting process here. What's really happening, we've sort of built the foundation now, what I've talked about up to this point, that the soil is full of microorganisms, and really what's happening with composting is you're decomposing that organic matter, and it's totally fueled by these soil organisms. So you really need the soil organisms to do the job properly to produce the compost for you, to break down that organic matter that you're putting in your composter. And the fuel for the organisms is a mixture of materials, and they're often described as browns and greens. And browns are organic material that's high in carbon, and greens are material that have more nitrogen in them. So that's how we separate them. And we use this term, the CN, carbon nitrogen ratio, to figure out what we should be feeding these organisms to have a properly working compost. So the CN ratio preferred by the organisms is about 30:1. That's will give them the best opportunity to reproduce, to respire. So when they're decomposing that organic matter, they're going to be producing carbon dioxide that's going to be respired into the atmosphere. But what we want to be feeding them is this ratio of about 30:1 between carbon and nitrogen. And so the success of composting really depends on providing that perfect mixture. And how we do that is by providing a combination of these different materials that we have around our house, in our garden, and so on, to build the compost and to provide that fuel. So you can see here a list of the carbon nitrogen ratios for these different common materials that we might provide to our compost. Classified them into the greens here at less than 25:1 carbon ratio to nitrogen. And above that, these are our browns. So things like food scraps, grass clippings, they have higher amounts of nitrogen in them than the browns. There's still a lot more carbon in them than nitrogen, but they have more nitrogen than the browns down at this end of the scale. And then when we move into the browns, you see we go from leaves, fallen leaves off trees, ranging from 35:1 to 85:1, depending on the species of tree, all the way up to things like sawdust, which are very high in carbon and have very little nitrogen in them. So the real key to good composting is to provide a recipe that results in approximately this ratio, 1 part of green to 3 parts of brown. And the key is really to avoid the extremes. So you don't want to be putting 95% of your compost as sawdust in there. By the same token, you don't want to be just putting grass clippings into your compost, because in that case, you have too much carbon or too much nitrogen there, not enough carbon. So when I say this, it's just an approximation. I have read in some places where people say, well, they measure the buckets out and do this really accurately. And in our home compost here, we don't do that, but we keep this in mind as we're adding all the things that we're producing from our garden, our yard, our kitchen, and so on. So the other 2 key elements for the compost are aeration and moisture. So again, these soil organisms, they need moisture to do their business, but they don't want to be saturated. So you need your compost in a location where it's going to get some moisture, but maybe not be dried out. So in my case, I put an open lid on the top of it. And you also need aeration. So a compost this size, I've got open slats along the sides you can see here. But another trick that I did that I found somewhere was I actually put 2 pipes down into the compost with holes drilled into the pipes along its course to provide aeration to the entire pile, to the middle of the pile, where it might be difficult to get aeration, oxygen to without doing that. So those are the good needs in the case of composting: the right fuel, aeration, and moisture to provide that. So drawing the link now between composting and climate change, and maybe for the last few minutes here, maybe the most interesting part to some of you in terms of the Sioux Climate Hub, there's really 2 components to think about when we're thinking about composting and climate change. And the first one is what happens to the organic materials if they are not composted. So that's number one. And the second one is what happens to the compost after we produce it. So what we're looking at here in terms of composting is we have the opportunity to actually have a plus from the point of view that we will avoid emissions. And I'll talk about that more in detail just on the next slide. So by doing compost, we're going to avoid some emissions that we might have. And also on the plus side, we're going to enable some carbon sequestration into the soil. One of the negative parts of it is what are the emissions from any of the equipment that we are required to use to do the composting. So this is the idea of looking at the entirety of the operation. If we're composting in a large urban center, for example, we're going to need vehicles, we're going to need equipment to move compost around and so on. And those are, of course, our greenhouse gas producing vehicles as well. So we have to look at both aspects of that in terms of the pluses and the negatives from any process that we might use. So here's the big advantage, if you like, of composting from the way I see it, is this idea of where does the compost go where does the organic material go if we don't compost it? So if we landfill all of that material, we throw it into with our main stream of garbage of any kind, what you find is within a landfill, and this has been shown in a lot of studies, is you're not promoting aerobic conditions. There's no oxygen getting to the materials within the pile. So in actual fact, what you're getting is the creation of predominantly the greenhouse gas methane that's coming out of the organic material decomposing. If you do it in a compost pile, and again, this shows a picture of a home composting pile, but it could be scaled up to obviously municipal level composting. Once you provide that aeration, it ends up that the breakdown of the organic material and the respiration of the organisms is producing carbon dioxide in that aerated environment. And the key thing to know about that change is that methane gas is 21 times greater in terms of its global warming potential. So what this means is that over a period of time, in this case, this table represents over 100 years, based on the fact that methane can hold the heat into the earth for a longer period of time, and also the dissipation of these gases when they go into the atmosphere, methane has a 21 times greater warming potential than carbon dioxide. So instantly there you can see that moving to more of an aerobic composting type of system can decrease the overall effect of greenhouse gases within the atmosphere. So the overall message is here, the proper composting, the right fuel, the right aeration, the right moisture will minimize greenhouse gas emissions. When we look at the other side of what are the benefits of the compost, remember I said the one side is what we do with if we're not composting the organic matter, what are we doing with it? Now we're looking at the compost benefits. Then we see that the there's a lot more tipping the balance towards doing composting. And you may have heard this phrase before, the circular economy. That's the idea of circulating our resources without any waste within our economy. And of course, that's part of the nutrient cycle. So cycling nutrients from growing plants above ground into below ground, into above ground, and having that cycle going on. So how the first element is we're going to improve the soil and also the environment as well. How are we going to do that? Well, by taking this compost and adding it back to the soil, whether it be in a garden, forest, wherever, agriculture, we're going to increase soil moisture. That's going to be held because we've got more organic matter from the compost. Nutrients, we're going to increase the biodiversity within the soil because of those organisms that we're adding. In the long term, we're going to probably increase the carbon sequestration in the soil as well from adding that compost. And with less water use and so on, we're going to have, and also adding the compost itself, we're going to have less fertilizer runoff. We don't have to use as much of those things. So that falls into the resource use, reduced water, reduced fertilizer, reduced herbicide and pesticide. And of course, all you can see with all of these things, it takes greenhouse gas emissions to produce water, fertilizer, herbicide, pesticide, transport, and so on. So we're saving there as well. And the last one here in this resource use is we're going to reduce landfilling too. And that's a huge thing in terms of cost to municipalities. And the fun stuff about the composting is we're going to grow some great food, good food. We're going to have fun exploring composting, figuring out how it works. So exploring the soil world and saving money. This is a shot of my garden from a couple of years ago with all the produce from, again, using compost in our own composter and feeding it back into the garden. Just about going to finish off here, just another few minutes. I got a couple more slides here. I did a little bit of research myself because I was just curious. Again, I live in Echo Bay. I do composting in my own backyard. Lots of people may do that that are on in this group, but one thing that's really interesting is how this could be scaled up. And this is where I think there might be more interest for the Sioux Climate Hub here, is just in this idea of doing this at a greater level within municipalities. And I was interested to find out, just looking at this, that there is actually a food and organic waste policy statement by the Ontario government that's, I guess, mandating a 50% waste reduction and resource recovery of food and organic waste by 2025. And just a few facts about organic matter waste and food waste in Ontario. This blew my mind. 31 billion dollars worth of food waste wasted in Ontario annually. That's about 3.6 tons of food and organic waste annually. We actually landfill about 60% of that in Ontario. And that's in spite of the fact that even right now there's 90 municipal green bin programs throughout the province. And I did a bit of searching to find out about some of these green bin programs. And I often get, my son lives in Toronto, and I'm always amazed there when he's throwing all this stuff into his green bin, his compost bin in Toronto. You can see the list of stuff here, which includes pet waste, diapers, pizza boxes, paper bags, all kinds of stuff that they're recycling in the green bin in Toronto. To my knowledge, the only green bin organic material recycling program in Northern Ontario, I think is in Sudbury, and this gives a list of all the things that they recycle there as well in their green cart, not their green bin there. So there's certainly 90 programs throughout the province. There's lots of examples of where this is being done. And again, people in this group and others would know better than me. I'm not sure if these are part of the discussions in Sault Ste. Marie at all. I know a number of years ago, there was a plan that didn't work out to use the methane gas that was coming off the landfill. And that's another thing you can do, is recycle that methane gas to use as a fuel, but I think that didn't go through. But I'm not sure if there are other discussions in the Sioux about this type of organic matter recycling program. So last slide, and I talked to the organizers about providing these links. There was a few things Rob asked me about. Some of you folks have made, and I know there's lots of people in Clean North that do work with worm composting. Rob asked me about invasive jumping worms, and there's a little bit there. I won't talk about that unless somebody has a question about it. And another thing that's been in the news that I've looked at over the last couple of years is this idea of soil-borne diseases. So certain bacteria and fungi that can cause diseases, lots of respiratory, I shouldn't say lots of diseases, several diseases in humans. So there's some website here. I guess the bottom line of this is it's a very small chance, and it's very regional where these diseases are. So I'll leave it there. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll look at the chat here and try and answer any questions. Thank you very much. Okay. I should just launch into the questions then, Rob?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. I'm just reading down here. I got one from Carol Martin. I heard some leaves are less beneficial for the compost than others. In particular, I heard some oak leaves may harm the compost or plants you try and grow in it. Is there any truth to that? It's a good question, Carol. On that carbon to nitrogen ratio that I showed quite a large range in terms of the carbon nitrogen ratio for leaves. And oak leaves are one of the ones that are on the high end in terms of their carbon nitrogen ratio. So what that means is they're not going to harm your compost or plants if they're used in the right proportion. So in the case of oak leaves, you'd have to use less oak leaves than a type of leaf that has a lower carbon nitrogen ratio, or add more food scraps to your compost to compensate for that large amount of carbon that you're putting in the compost from oak leaves. Hope that helps. From T. Kern, many of us live on properties with lawns and gardens in Sault Ste. Marie. What are the key things we can do to enhance the life and efficiency of the soil on our patches of land and public spaces? Yeah, so a little, I mean, certainly the composting that I've talked about here is important as well, but I guess in terms of overall carbon sequestration, I guess one of the important things to do is to plant something. So I guess we had a director at the Canadian Forest Service for many years that said you can't go wrong planting a tree. And I guess that makes sense as well. And you've probably heard that in sort of the general federal government plan now of planting 1 billion trees across Canada. So I think that's a good way in terms of enhancing the carbon sequestration and soil life as well. From Kara, do you have any suggestions on how to promote no-till farming here? My worm tea killed my lilac. Is there a recommendation about worm tea? I don't know about worm tea, Kara. Is that from worm castings then? I'm assuming, but I don't know that. I don't know much about that. So I couldn't answer that. On the no-till farming, it's interesting. And again, I'm a gardener. I'm not a farmer. I'm always, there's certain things that are being promoted right now, no-till farming, cover crops, I think, that are having some uptake within some of the farming community in this area. So the idea of no-till farming is the fact that you're going to keep the carbon sequestered within the soil. Once you till up the soil and provide that aeration, you're providing faster decomposition, which is producing more carbon dioxide out of the soil. So that's having an effect on the atmosphere rather than holding that carbon within the soil. So I'm not an expert in that area, but I have a feeling that some of these ideas like no-tilling and cover cropping are becoming much more popular, or farmers are being made more aware of that in this region anyways. And I know RAIN has, RAIN, the Rural Agriculture Innovation Network, has been doing a lot of work to promote those kind of climate-friendly agricultural practices for sure. Oh, there's Amanda's commented, Kara, about your worm tea. Worm wee should be diluted depending on the plant you're using, 1 part wee to 10 to 20 parts water. If it's vermicast, then a handful to 1 watering can. So maybe the concentration of the worm tea was too high for the lilac, what it sounds like. Not seeing any more questions there, Rob. See lots of familiar names here, and thanks everybody for listening in tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. That was awesome. And I'd just like to remind everyone that next week's Climate Hub webinar will be Kim Chapman, again focusing on cycling. That's bicycle cycling. I guess it has to do somewhat with recycling, but she'll be talking about bicycle cycling as carbon-free transportation, information about bikes, local routes, and safe cycling practices. So please join us on Wednesday, June the 23rd at 7:30 for that. And also, we are certainly looking for more people to join the Climate Hub, to become members. It's all free, and all that happens is you get asked to do stuff, or you can avoid that. So please join us next month and consider joining the Climate Hub as well. Thanks again, Paul, and we'll talk to everybody soon.
Thanks much, Rob, and thank you everybody again.